Welcome to module 5 in Fin525, in what is probably the most important aspect of financial institution management, which is the regulatory aspect of its management. In other words, how much capital needs to be reserved for a financial institution to cover its losses in extreme circumstances. And so this really has been influenced, in the last couple of years by the global financial crisis. Most European and American banks, for example, held far less capital in reserve than Australian banks did under APRA's regulatory regime, and hence that was the underlying reason why Australian banks, along with their lack of exposure, I guess, to those more risky products, were in far better shape during the global financial crisis. So this whole argument about regulatory capital, how much needs to be set aside, before we sort of look at the detail of that, you really need to have strongly in your head the framework or the rationale as to why financial institutions are still regulated. Okay, and that is because those regulations should have prevented incidents like the global financial crisis, where the financial sector has such a massive effect now on the real economy. So they don't produce goods and services, but they fund the production of goods and services. And so any issues around their viability have these quite significant earthquake type effects out into the real economy. So the availability of credit, for example, is a vital ingredient to the continuation of the production of goods and services now in our modern economy, and financial institutions provide that. So any issues surrounding the viability of financial institutions are transmitted then straight away into the real economy. And so that affects people's lives in terms of employment, in terms of their long-term earnings, etc., as we've seen in the global financial crisis. And so that's why it's important, and that's why financial institutions are regulated. Now, Australia has always had an excellent regulatory regime in terms of its financial institutions, particularly its depository-taking institutions, its banks. There have been bank failures in Australia. However, they have been sort of handled and not catastrophic. Now, the major changes, of course, are to Basel III, and there's some readings on that from the RBA in the readings for this topic, those changes. Now, we don't really need to get down into the dirts and weeds of the actual changes. What I really would like, what my real objective from this module is for you, is to have an understanding of why they're regulated and what those broad regulations cover. There was such a debate around the global financial crisis, and within academic circles, I guess, and government circles, it was widely acknowledged that the regulatory regime failed. But it was never really a popular thing. It was never really a mainstream thing. We never had that debate in the public domain of the reason for the global financial crisis was that the regulatory regime did not keep pace with the financial products. A large proportion of those institutions were outside the reach of the regulatory regime, particularly in the US, and that the capital that they were required to set aside was just, quite frankly, inadequate. And so from an analyst point of view, you need to recognise that and recognise how Basel III will change activities in banks, will change practices in banks, particularly in the US and Europe. Now, Australian banks are probably already well situated to meet the Basel III requirements, and so it will not be such a major change in practice for them. Other banks will struggle to meet those requirements because it will require a major change of practice. So I guess that's really what the objective of this module is to get you up to speed in terms of the current state of that regulatory regime that's progressively being introduced now, why it needed to be introduced post-GFC, and that Australian regulatory regime has been very effective in managing the risks of financial and particularly depository taking institutions in Australia.